Well, hello, everybody. We are so glad that you have joined us. And this is really going to be an engaging conversation, and I would encourage you to lean in. I'm joined today by a very special guest. If you've been with City, you will know she has joined us before. And so joining us all the way from the beautiful KZN is Sandy van Vuuren. We can give her a welcome. Hands up wherever you are. And Sandy, how are you doing?
I am doing very well. I would be misrepresenting the truth if I did not say that today held a whole host of challenges of its own, but of course, I have the opportunity to test whether what I say in the therapeutic space I can apply to myself, and that it is not so much what happens to me, but how I choose to respond to it. So here I am, right and ready to chat to you, Duncan.
Amazing. Well, Sandy, I always love talking to you. If you don't know, Sandy is a psychologist, a Christian psychologist, one who is loving Jesus and really wanting to help us, especially during this time of lockdown. And so we're going to jump into a few questions. And our big topic, our main topic that we'll be focusing in on this conversation is looking at relationships through lockdown. We all know that there can be stress and anxiety and fear, and how do we navigate all of these things. So Sandy, I'm going to start out with just one quick fire question that I'm sure will get your juices going. But what has been your take on this season of lockdown, of the coronavirus, of COVID-19 as we're experiencing it?
Duncan, that question has sat with me for a while, and I have been very aware of the fact that quite a lot of focus has been on the physical effect. So let's say how the infection can be contracted or staved off between sanitation and masks and social distancing and the like. And then the economic ramifications that has been expounded upon at length. But you know what I've realized is that there has been less attention actually paid to the psychological ramifications of COVID-19, and especially, Duncan, for those who already are struggling with pre-existing conditions pertaining to psychological issues with which they've been grappling. And so it's been interesting for me if I can zone in on the psychological with your permission, because obviously the economic and the physical, the medical side specifically lie a little bit outside my ambit of expertise. But the psychological, I've noticed even within that context, Duncan, a certain dichotomy. That on the one hand, where there is increased cortisol, that stress hormone that is secreted by the adrenal glands, for some, increased cortisol, as difficult as this might be to believe, there are many for whom a decreased cortisol secretion has been experienced. Now, I know this sounds anomalous, but it is true that for those with decreased cortisol secretion, they suddenly feel in control of their environment. They know exactly where their children are in their space. They don't have anxieties about what they're going to be exposed to and with whom they're going to be mixing, and all sorts of similar out of control type realities with which, let's say, someone who struggles with anxiety might be prone to experience prior to lockdown. The increased cortisol, I think all of us are all too familiar with, Duncan. Suddenly that incredible stress that comes with, will I contract it? Will somebody that I love contract it? What will happen to me and to my family, economically and otherwise, our livelihoods, food on our table, where we will live? And so that is the first dichotomy. The second dichotomy that has been so interesting for me to observe is this almost, I call it a pendulum swing, Duncan. And I know that my descriptors are enormously uncharitable, because I say it's a pendulum swing between a kind of paralyzing preoccupation on the one hand And the other extreme, a kind of gormless gambling, just foolishness. So let me explain what I mean. The paralyzing preoccupation, how I devour every link, every YouTube clip, every piece of video footage, or I can be on news 24, literally 24 hours 7. And I can't get around to doing anything else because I become consumed with all that I am, this onslaught, this barrage of information. And then the gormless gambling, or let me use the more charitable terms that others have used. So you get the ultra cautious, I've just described them now, and then you get the ultra casual. And what happens is that, let's say, for instance, the ultra casual, where they might feel, I've been abroad, I know I've been in a hot spot, but I am wired to be a naturally demonstrative person. So I'm coming home, and this nonsense of sanitizing and social distancing, that is for the birds, because my loved ones need to know that I'm back safely and I'm going to hug them regardless. And of course, that ignites in those, can you imagine, with the paralyzing preoccupation, or even some who are swinging in the middle, which I'll speak about in a moment, they get filled with such anger at this kind of gormless gambling with the well-being that they are trying to safeguard. So that swinging pendulum, again, the dichotomy. The last dichotomy that I want to talk about, and maybe before I move on to that, I want to say that the middle ground is the safe ground, both with the gambling, the preoccupation, just being vigilant, doing what is required to maximize the chances of preserved health, and yet at the same time, not becoming so fearful that you then feel, I don't want to have any connection with anyone. I want to just hole up in my home and not do any of the basic tasks that might be required of me. But I did say I was going to go on to a last dichotomy, to use that word again. And here, I think personality theory comes into the mix a little, where you see on the one hand, some of the introverts who would be loving connection, but preferring with a small group, finding lockdown bringing a reprieve almost of sorts, that they no longer have to feel ugly about declining invitations, because introverts are not unpopular people. They are socially skilled, they are delightful people, but they need to recharge their batteries on their own so that they can face another day. And then for them, it is very challenging when they have to decline invitation after invitation after invitation because they're actually needing to recharge their batteries. But this lockdown period actually relieved them of that. And so there's almost like a little bit of a Stockholm syndrome, which it's not altogether the right term to use, but let's say, for lack of a better term, that they've almost fallen in love with their prison keeper called lockdown, and rather savoring this, and in fact are starting to express anxiety to me around what when lockdown is over. I suddenly will be losing control over this environment that has become so predictable for me. And then you get the poor extroverts, Duncan. They are the ones who struggled with cabin fever. They just want to get out there. They are going crazy. And so, yes, as a nation, there are just so many different realities. And I know there's this popular, I don't know whether one would call it a poem, saying, we are all in the same storm. That is not inaccurate, but we are not all in the same boat.
Yeah.
We have very different realities with which we contend. Does that answer your question sufficiently well?
It does. I'm anyone who knows me knows I'm a big guy when it comes to balance and trying to find where that middle ground is in absolutely everything. It's so helpful, and I love your pendulum idea and that those kind of dichotomies. And I think everyone has seen it just in how we've approached how we and how we relate to the season. I think sometimes when we're talking about relationships through lockdown, we forget that we will have a relationship with this season and with lockdown, and we need to acknowledge it and know where we're going and how we are approaching it. And so I want to dive deeper. You spoke a little bit about some of the things that maybe are on the positive side, maybe on the negative side of how we approach this, but dive a little deeper into some of the things you have seen and experienced that maybe are ways that are a bit more destructive, even if they're unavoidable, but destructive ways where people might be approaching this season.
Oh, that is so good that you slipped the word unavoidable or unintentional. You're quite right, Duncan. They are destructive reactions, and oftentimes we have to fight so hard to resist those impulses. And so for me, the very first one that comes to mind is this overwhelming sense of fear of the unknown. Not one of us relishes that inability to predict what the future holds. And I think that's why you will get many who have almost insatiable curiosity to find out what is it that tomorrow will hold, regardless of how they need to come by that information. But fear is, for me, one of the destructive, even if unintentional, reactions that comes in the wake of something like COVID-19. And we'll get perhaps to looking a little deeper at some of the causative factors. But I want to go straight on to talk about another, for me, response. No, let me rather stick to reaction. Reaction that is not helpful is that of frustration, heightened frustration. I set goals, Sandy, for myself. I knew where I was headed, whether it be with regard to what I wanted my children to achieve in this year, whether it be at a microcosmic level within my home, just finishing certain tasks, finishing certain projects, or whether it be at a macrocosmic level, whether it be what I had set myself for the year, economically or otherwise. And I feel so frustrated, Sandy, that I am being thwarted in the way I'm being thwarted. And oftentimes, I will try to gather myself, Sandy, and say, okay, let me readjust. Let me see whether I can't change my goals. And even in a given day, I might set a goal. And the next thing, this child starts complaining that he has a need that I don't really believe is one anything other than attention seeking. I don't have the insight in that moment to realize that I should just attend to that need for attention. Instead, the child inside of me, Sandy, elbows my adult within out of the way, and just that frustration goes through the ceiling. So for me, that is yet another destructive reaction. A third one, Duncan, is that of insecurity. Now, insecurity gets triggered very easily when we have an inability to know how will we provide. You see, it is helpful if we operate within a framework of reference where we know that the Father we serve owns cattle on 1,000 hills. It is helpful. We are human, that not despite. Or that our Father has promised that He has a plan to prosper us and not to harm us. We still sit with this insidious sense of insecurity stirring within. Or we can even try to echo King David's words, where he would say, I once was young, and now I am old, and I have yet to see the righteous forsaken, or their children begging for bread. In my humanity, you see, Duncan, I believe And yet I have to say to the Father, help me in my unbelief. So that I see often in my practice. Interestingly, something that took me totally off guard because I felt it was illegitimate. So the fourth, non-productive or unhelpful or destructive reaction is that of guilt. And I tried to understand this. I tried to figure out why guilty. And you know where I saw most of it coming to the fore is in a context where I've had the opportunity to journey alongside health practitioners. Now, you might or might not have heard of the volunteer initiative. 150 psychologists have responded to it across the nation called #Care for COVID-19 Carers. So we've been receiving phenomenal training at the hands of top-class trainers, and opportunities are provided within that context to come alongside health practitioners. But outside of that, I have had the opportunity to chat to multiple health practitioners. And the guilt stems from the strangest source. And that is, Sandy, as a result of practicing in the arena that I do, I am being exposed far more often and with greater likelihood to COVID-19. And the guilt I feel at knowing that I'm carrying it into my community, into my family, where I want to go home and be with my loved ones, and yet I'm aware that I can't touch them. I desperately need a hug, but I can't. So I feel guilty that my little ones are looking at me perplexed. What's going on? Why can I not receive the affection that I had previously relished and been at the receiving end of? And so that guilt starts to burgeon and create all sorts of problems. Linked with that guilt, Duncan, is also a sense of helplessness, that there is this gargantuan entity called COVID-19 that makes it impossible to come alongside those whom we most care for. So let's say aged parents who are sitting in a context where that particular, let's say it's a retirement village, have in wisdom elected to lock down, no visitors from outside permitted. And the utter helplessness because that particular parent, aged parent, is not sufficiently technologically savvy to be able to navigate WhatsApp or Skype or any of the other mechanisms that would facilitate contact, and the utter helplessness, that impotence of I can do nothing in this situation. I'm going to start wrapping up on this, but it's just lying so close to my heart that I just felt I had to elaborate. For me, something else that I have noticed is around the time issue. And I allude back to that metaphor of we are all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. And that pertains very, very specifically to the whole issue around time. That for some, there is so much time on their hands. They don't know what to do with it. And some are not even using it in a way that is creative or constructive. And so when the individual in the family, perhaps, whose time isn't very tight, maybe they are working a full day, albeit that they are at home. They are having to be behind the computer. They're having to navigate platforms like Zoom that are totally unfamiliar to them. And in that moment, there's this feeling of, oh, I just don't feel understood. This person is just not understanding that time is not my friend. I cannot just be available to them in the way that I previously would have wanted to.
Yeah. I love how you use that word reaction, and like it does come down to that idea that there are some of these things that are just reactions that well up within us that we have no control of. But it's so important to be aware of them, If you're aware of it, then you're able to do something about it. And I'm sure even as you were going through that, all of those elements and all those different destructive patterns you've seen, I'm sure there were at some level people watching going, I'm sitting in that zone right now. And being made aware of it is sometimes so helpful. On the constructive side, and I would like to get you to talk around that, but constructive ways that you think we could approach this season. The amazing thing is it's not as much reaction, it's far more response. And so that's a lot more choice driven. And that's where we can get practical and get ourselves acting. What are some of those constructive ways that you believe we can approach this season?
I'm sure you can sense a kind of burgeoning excitement within me, because I've always been one that gets my juices fired up by looking at those practical realities. And so often I say that if you look at transformation, you know what, Duncan? Transformation never comes through information. We can be dispensing a whole host of tidbits of information, but it's when we close that triangle and it's application of the information that brings about the transformation. And so here we go into the applied arena, and I like that intention, the idea of intentionality. We need to be intentional, and the idea of it being a response in terms of our intentionality, in contrast to the reaction where we were addressing that a moment ago. So let me fire away with some things that come to mind immediately. And the first is the whole notion of renewing our mind daily. I know that that is a Romans 12 idea, renew our minds daily and do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but instead be transformed through this renewing of your mind. And I often look at psychological theory and the merit of psychological theory as it lines up with scripture. So I look at somebody like Professor Albert Ellis or Dr. Albert Ellis, who really is seen as the father of rational emotive therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. And in truth, he very much was endorsing exactly what Romans 12 is saying, that notion of taking your thought patterns and understanding, as a man thinketh, so it will be. That the way we think very definitely has an impact on our behavior, on our words. And I'm going to start with one of the practical mechanisms here that I have found helpful, is being able to identify that non-productive impulse or thought, Duncan, in the moment of provocation, not 5 seconds later or 5 minutes later, 5 hours later, but in the moment, identify it, then through intentionality, stop it. So that's thought identify, thought stop, thought capture, take it captive. Sometimes that has to happen through journaling. Other times we can do it through internal dialogue. Internal dialogue is a very powerful tool, and literally talk to ourselves aloud, even if people think we're going a little bit dilly. But lockdown has finally got to mom or to dad. Be that as it may. And then we reframe. We try to look at that reality through a different lens. And I think that that is really key. Taking those thoughts captive that otherwise would very much hijack us. I think that is the word I'm looking for. Hijack, like an amygdala hijacking. That we need to be intentional in our minds. And in the spirit of that renewal of mind, that as agents of choice, Duncan, that sometimes we imagine that we are just these little, almost like human leaves being carried forward inexorably on the current called COVID-19. And that's not altogether accurate. I am an agent of choice. If I can just stop myself for a moment and say, in this situation, I can either capitulate to my fear or to my frustration, and in the process, create endless additional problems, or I can exercise that reality that I am an agent of choice. And so that takes me on to my third point that I want to, in terms of making decisions that are constructive and intentionally doing this. And that is to try and cultivate, Duncan, a solution-focused mindset rather than a problem-orientated one. And so I need to be aware of how cortisol, which we spoke about right at the beginning, that stress hormone, will impact on my ability to be creative. So I'm hoping before today's interview is done, that I can talk about some of the strategies to stave off this cortisol accumulation. But back again now to the solution-focused orientation. And that we try to keep our cortisol levels at bay so that our creativity in generating those solutions at least can remain intact. And I think that it is as we do that, we can immediately start. So I'll give an example. If I want to be solution focused, I notice that there is a dynamic in my family that is contributing to an adversarial atmosphere. And so I decide the solution is for me to become a climate creator. So what is required of me to be a climate creator? Now go and think of some of those, what we call authentic A's of relationship, the authentic affirmation, the authentic appreciation, the authentic acknowledgement, authentic affection. I mean, I could wax and wane on that one alone. And we know that talk is cheap. So if we're wanting to authentically affirm or acknowledge or appreciate, we need to think climate creation. How can I do that? Oh, I know, I can be thoughtful, because I know my spouse absolutely has an issue around a made-up bed, cannot get into a bed, regardless of how clean the linen is, if it has not been made up. And I'm fine. If a bed's not made up, as long as the linen's clean, for me, it's a total waste of time. It's the silliest thing. Why make up a bed? Nobody's coming into our home anyway. So this is silly. We can be stewarding our time far more sensibly. But in the spirit of being solution-focused, with a view to being a climate creator, I think, well, it might be thoughtful, or it might be respectful, or whatever other attribute I feel could contribute to creating that climate that I most want in my home. Let me think of those little things. It might be the coffee cup. The coffee cup analogy it is not about the bed or the coffee cup. It is about what it symbolizes, that when I do that, it communicates to the other person, you matter. And the little things that matter to you matter to me. And so I'm going to be intentional about coming alongside you when it comes to that kind of reality. I think for me, the last thing that I would want to bring into this equation is that if I have the ability to be flexible and adaptable and almost reinvent myself, if one wants to use that term, we position ourselves a whole lot more favorably, Duncan. I think immediately of a young South African, and I imagine that a whole host of individuals listening to this particular interview will know exactly who I'm speaking about. So as a result of lockdown, he has not been able to perform in restaurants or in any other social context. He cannot do any gigs anymore. However, he immediately thought flexible, adaptable, and reinventing self would perhaps carry him through this particularly challenging time. And so what he did was he set up his cell phone strategically, went out on the balcony of his apartment, dressed himself up beautifully in the smartest of Italian suits with a tie, slicked back his hair, and with this magnificent voice, serenaded, captured it, and put it onto Instagram. And so what has happened is that he is still very much keeping himself in the public eye and will remain really sought after, more than likely, once this lockdown time has passed. But he needed to figure out how to reinvent himself, how to be flexible, how to be adaptable. It's not the ideal. He has no audience to chivvy him along. So there we go. That's pretty much a response to that question you asked. Long response, but certainly something that I felt very strongly I wanted to share.
Yeah. No, it's so helpful, and I really love everything that you touched on. You began to pull it in, and I want to talk about it a little bit more in the next section. But obviously, we know what happens on the inside spills out, and so now this relational storm that might be going on inside, because we might be feeling anxious, we might be dealing with fear or stress or just the uncertainty of what's going on. Sometimes that can then spill out into the relationships we see around us. And so even if we're in that place, we're all trying to cope. And so there's some obviously healthy ways to cope and some unhealthy ways to cope. And I was wanting to hear from you from your experience and what you've seen. And you can hit both. What are some of the helpful ways you've seen people, and the helpful kind of coping mechanisms people have put in place, but then also on the other side, the unhelpful ones that maybe are going to hurt not just ourselves, but also those who are around us?
Well, Duncan, I will keep the unhealthy brief, perhaps, in the spirit of wanting to maximize the positive, minimize the negative, which is really a strategy for coping in these times as well. But I do think, we call them the ABCs of unhelpful coping mechanisms, really. They are ones that we would have evidenced in the course of our own journey through life. Maybe we ourselves have indulged in those coping mechanisms. But the ABCs are actually going to be A, B, C, D, and E. So just hang in there with me. But the A to which I refer is this burgeoning anger. So I become explosive. This vitriolic vomit just spews out, regardless of the fact that I might be aware that there is this injunction, in your anger, do not sin. I go for broke. Because you see, in that moment of anger, I experience almost like a cathartic release of all this pent-up emotion. However, Duncan, the sad reality about that anger exploding over and above the detritus, over and above the emotional shrapnel that goes and wedges itself into the hearts of those around us, there is also that spark of cortisol within me. In order to stir up that anger successfully, I need to have the cortisol to drive it. And oftentimes, we, by our own hand, can jettison ourselves into the Pond of Despond, because that cortisol, its first point of attack will be our serotonin. Our serotonin is the stuff that gives us our get up and go, Duncan. And so we will very quickly feel our get up and go has got up and gone. And we will feel over it. We don't care. I just want to get out of here. And again, to quote John Bunyan, Pond of Despond is not a great place to be. And that was all those many hundred years ago when he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. He's already cautioning us that the Pond of Despond is a dark place. And yet we, by our own hand, can almost bring that on ourselves. Duncan, the next unhelpful response or coping mechanism is that of blame. And I want to say to you immediately that you will achieve precious little by blaming others for this reality. It might be the government that you feel you want to blame. You want to blame them for mismanaging the lockdown period. They could have done it differently. Hindsight is always the perfect science. And we will feel frustrated when we see how things could have been done differently and they were not done differently. But it is a debilitating response. Or worse yet, is when we start to blame those who are in our immediate framework of reference. So I'm feeling poorly about myself, but I start to blame you because I notice that certain things that ought to have been done or ought to have been purchased never were. So the classical example of we needed certain supplies in our home in order to live out this lockdown period. You were not sufficiently proactive. You are responsible for the purchases. Now there are none of those items on the shelf, and you are putting us at risk. You are the one who is making this household have to pay a price that was unnecessary. Now, that kind of blaming behavior is not going to, in any way, bring about the kind of cohesion, the kind of climate we spoke about a moment ago, that would position you as a family more favorably. I'm going to move on swiftly to the C and the D and the E, if I can, Duncan. And the C really dovetails so much with blame, and that is around criticism and even comparison. So the criticism constantly harping on and on about things that are not getting done. You know, I can't understand it. I have been doing the washing, the ironing, the cooking, the this, the that. What have you done? You show me. What have you contributed? You just sit and do absolutely nothing. Whereas that person might well have been endeavoring to do certain things behind the scenes while the individual who is complaining, so it's complaining, criticism, comparison, whatever else we want to use, they might have been having to look after the children, might have been having to make sure that perhaps they are doing what is required of them in this period called lockdown, whether it be educationally or otherwise. And I'm going to go straight onto D, because in the face of that criticism or comparison, let's say comparison of, I know so-and-so's partner or so-and-so's spouse, almost as if that's going to ignite greater motivation in the heart of the person being criticized, who does this and this and this and this, what do you do? Now, of course, if the criticism is legitimate, which takes me now to the D, we have to be jolly sure, Duncan, that a coping mechanism that is not constructive is that of defensiveness on the one hand, or denial. So now, let's do defensiveness first. I would really love to encourage folk, throw that defense attorney mantle away and approach that criticism like any self-respecting dog would approach a good meaty bone, and chew whatever is growthful from that criticism, what is valid. There maybe I do need to be more contributive. Maybe this is not an invalid observation. Maybe I need to think a little bit more carefully what I could be doing that would contribute to the household running in a way where all individuals are trying to contribute within their ability and capacity to the best that they can. Denial is simply minimizing all of the realities. When the partner tries to talk about unbridled spending around, so let's say for argument's sake, one individual is apportioned the task of going and buying groceries, comes home with luxury items that are way beyond the budget of that household. And the individual who is not shopping, but is observing what has been purchased and has to settle the accounts for what has been purchased, tries to communicate to the shopper that this is not prudence. And there is this utter denial. We will be fine, don't worry, you're stressing for nothing. When in truth, it is a very real concern, and they could find themselves in a huge jam after the fact if this person continues. So it's not a helpful coping mechanism, denial or defensiveness. And then the last is entitlement. Entitlement for me, so it's the A, B, C, D, E, the entitlement of I feel the full impact of COVID-19 and lockdown far more keenly than anyone else in this home, because I might have a pre-existing condition that makes me vulnerable, or it might be that I contribute so much to the running of this home when it comes to finance that I am entitled to be waited upon and enforced. And please don't you dare require of me to contribute anything beyond the fact that I'm generating finance or I'm doing this. It does not work well. As much as I feel it's a coping mechanism to deal with the pressure that is pushing in on me from every side, to say, no, hang on, I need that pressure to recede by telling them I'm entitled to have an easier time than everybody else. Not helpful, Duncan. So that's my ABCs for now.
And then on the helpful side, what are some of the things you've observed that we could use that maybe we're not using right now as healthy coping mechanisms?
Okay, so can I go into 5 different dimensions, or 4? Maybe I'll stick to 4, because I'm going to start off with the first being around the physical. And for me, although it lies outside my ambit of expertise, I'm wanting to be very clear that what we eat and drink is very important. I know that dietitians will be quick to tell us that there are more Johnny neurotransmitters in our gut, Duncan, than in our brain. So if we eat certain things that upset the apple cart, it is going to impact on us emotionally. I know we don't all enjoy the luxury of being able to eat meals that are charged with protein and the like. But what I can say is that we can resist stimulants like caffeine or tannin or the sugars. I know that they are pleasurable. I know that they often are the very thing that brings a little bit of relief. But I'm going to make a distinction here, and maybe this is a good point to bring it in, that self-nurturing is an imperative. And I'll talk about that again. I hope I get the chance to. But self-soothing is like a scorpion with a sting in the tail. There are 2 different things. Self-nurturing is what we do. It's creative, it's constructive, it gets our juices going. It might be hobbies, it might be whatever. But self-soothing often it can be recreational substances if we can get access to them. It can be alcohol. It can be unbridled eating of the unhealthiest variety where we binge eat and imagine that we might be soothed by that. And I'm really using this opportunity to say, if there's ever an arena to identify that notion that I addressed a moment ago, of identify your impulse, your non-productive choice in the moment of provocation, and endeavor to do a 180-degree turn, I would say it is in this arena of resisting self-soothing. That even with alcohol, I know we don't have access to alcohol, but some of us have stockpiled sufficiently successfully. I think this is where a lot of blaming comes in when we haven't successfully, or the partner hasn't successfully stockpiled to our satisfaction. But the truth of the matter is, although we might feel that we relax for a moment as we quaff that alcoholic beverage, alcohol, sadly, is a notorious depressant, and we don't need anything in our diet in excess. Moderation is a different thing, but in excess that will take us down the creek without a paddle. Now, I'm not for a moment doing a sales pitch for wine. I do know that a glass of wine with all the resveratrols in it, red wine that is healthy, has its benefits. So I'm not for a moment trying to promote abstention. I'm saying balance. And then still in the physical, to look at our rest and relaxation. That, our brain consists of 3 different parts. So we've got the cortex and the neocortex. That is what we're busy engaging right now as I share all this information. It's the logical part that can sift through what I'm saying, decide what I'll embrace, what I won't embrace. The second part is the limbic system, where all the feelings are birthed. And then the third is this very primitive part of our brain, Duncan. But it's such an essential part of the brain and can be tricked very easily. But it's primitive, and yet it's the thing that will make our lungs move in and out so we can breathe, make our hearts beat, make our digestive systems work, will make our adrenal glands work so that cortisol that gets spontaneously secreted, make our eyes blink, and the list can go on and on and on. But if we learn the art of, let's say, progressive relaxation is a good example. That third part of the brain can get tricked very easily because you are contracting the muscles, you keep releasing them. It doesn't go back to the same state of tension. It drops down below, and suddenly that primitive part of the brain says, no more cortisol needed, the muscles are relaxing, it's absolutely fine. That kind of intervention is critical. Exercise is the only natural cortisol mopper. And if you are on meds, please be medication adherent. Stick to your regime. Vitamins, we know that zinc and vitamin C, and then the vitamin D3, we've got dollops of it that we can get. I know we're going into winter, but there's still lots of sunshine to be had, except for the poor people in the Cape. They're going to be going into winter rainfall time, but we still have access to that vitamin D3. Try to build in time in the course of your day just to get out there. So that would be in the arena of the physical. The sleep. Often insomnia, your circadian rhythms get totally messed up by all the excess cortisol. So the melatonin, that sleep-inducing hormone in the brain, just can't do its job quite the way we would like it to be doing its job. But that as you do the relaxation and the exercise, who knows, the insomnia and the restoration of the circadian rhythms might slowly but surely, there's no light switch, not abracadabra, but to pay attention to that. And that even if you aren't able to sleep, being in prone position already allows for the brain that is conditioned to associate that horizontal position with restoration of the neural cells of the brain, can impart in the dark. Don't put the light on and start to read. Rather just put some worship music on or anything else that is soothing. Keep the lights off. That is the physical. Then I want to go very quickly into the emotional, that internal space that births so much of the responses that I have already covered in the course of this interview. And that I spoke about journaling being an incredibly valuable tool, because in a way we take something that we feel very intensely about emotionally, and we are required to order little letters to make a word and order little words to make a sentence. And so we have to engage the left brain logical side. And in the process, what do we achieve? We then start to settle some of that right brain emotion as we trawl through and cathartic, just download into journal form. And whether it is if we decide we're going to start writing out our prayers, because we even feel like, oh, Sandy, you don't understand, I don't even feel like I can pray anymore. And that is not irregular, but maybe I'll just start writing out my prayers, find a little spot, rise before everybody else does. And then that brings me spontaneously, Duncan, to the third dimension, which is around spirituality, our spirit life. There are so many things that I could say here. I could go on for a very long time. We could just read something like Dr. Richard Foster's Tome, that good old oldie, the celebration of the disciplines. And we'd very quickly get a host of ideas of how in this time we could actually start to cultivate some of those disciplines. But for the purposes of this interview, I really want to stick to three things. The one for me is worship, that I'm so clear in my own mind that victory is preceded by worship. And we don't perhaps always feel like worshiping, but it's not about what we feel like. It is about the expression of our lips. And similarly with prayer and the word. So those would be my other two. We are instructed, pray without ceasing. And really, what does it look like? I don't have to be in a special little place. But that, if I want to go into the psychological arena, is really like reframing, because I can start praying the word, start praying those promises. I can start saying, you know what? I know that in Jeremiah 33 verse 3, it says, call to me and I'll show you great and unsearchable things you do not know in the natural. Or that I'm instructed to be anxious for nothing. What a perfect scripture that Philippians word is at this time. Be anxious for nothing, but with thanksgiving. Through prayer and petition. For me, I want to almost put, I know it says through prayer and petition with thanksgiving. I want to say with thanksgiving, that whole attitude of gratitude. Present all your requests so that the peace that surpasses all human understanding can guard your heart, which for me is the wellspring of emotion, and your mind, the wellspring of your thoughts, in Christ Jesus. That is what we can do as we write out our prayers, actively quote some of those promises. And then that takes you into the word actively as well. The last dimension I want to go into is the relational one. So we've looked at the physical, we've looked at the emotional, the spiritual, the relational, and you would have imagined that I should be addressing it a lot earlier. But you know what? We really have been created for connection and community, Duncan. And albeit that we are in the space of lockdown, we are not to neglect holding on fiercely to community and the injunction to continue meeting together, albeit that we've got to use electronic platforms to accomplish that.
Yeah.
And then to remember Dr. Henry Cloud's book, The Power of the Other, where he speaks about our craving for connection, Duncan, and those four quadrants that are so key. Yes, we'll have the no connection, where we just don't eat the same hay. The bad connection, which we in truth have touched on in this interview, where it's kind of hot, cold, it's erratic, it's unpredictable, and it's not ideal. It's bad connection. And then, of course, there's the very sad reality of the third quadrant, being that pseudo connection that is aided and abetted by the posturing and positioning that something like Facebook and Instagram might even have promoted. And then some, in a kind of knee-jerk reaction to that, are saying, oh, they're going to post the most terrible photos of themselves, almost to show that, we won't indulge in posturing and positioning. But that is something I won't comment on right now, but that is in itself a statement that the person is trying to make of assuming a position. And then the fourth quadrant is that of good connection. And I think that I might even have shared with you, his analogy of the cell phone, just in that circularity, looking for good connection. And I have already given some of the ingredients that connection would require. So relationally, with myself, with others, and upward, is really what I would want us to concentrate on strongly and say, what is the barometer reading of my relationship inwardly, with those around, and with the one above? I don't know if that has adequately answered that question, Duncan.
No, it's so good. I love that. I love how comprehensive it hits everywhere. Just before we finish, as we kind of wrap it up, why don't you briefly, very last question, And this is the last thing I want to hear from you is, what do you believe is the most important thing people need to hear and apply through this season of lockdown and COVID-19?
Okay, I am going to keep it brief then, Duncan. And the two things that I want to say. I'd love to refer the listeners to Jennifer Thomas. She wrote a book collaboratively with Dr. Gary Chapman of the 5 Love Languages fame. And it really is around the anatomy of apology. What does it look like? It's not good enough to just say sorry. And we're going to be having to say sorry a hang of a lot in this time. And we have to learn how to apologize well. So that would be the one thing that I'd like to bring into this. And then the last thing I'm going to say is Dr. Viktor Frankl's work. He was an Austrian psychiatrist who lived in the late 1930s, early 1940s in Austria, and as a Jewish psychiatrist landed in Auschwitz in that laboratory context that can never be emulated again, but that he observed something that he called tragic optimism. Professor Martin Seligman, who's the father of positive psychology, refers to it as positive emotion. But tragic optimism, or TO, that ability to remain optimistic in the presence of what constitutes tragedy, what constitutes absent ideal, and to have a hope beyond the now. And in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he sees some very interesting anomalies, that those who, for all intents and purposes, appeared frail and appeared to be the ones that would not do the distance, often did the distance, because he then determined through empirical study that it was their hope of something beyond the now that they would hold on to. And those who came in hale and hearty and strong, who did not have that hope, very often succumbed to all that they were being subjected to within that concentration camp context. So I would like to end by saying hope for me. I know Corinthians refers to the 3 big ones: faith, you touched on, the love for those around us, but hope, faith, hope, and love. But hope is what Dr. Viktor Frankl says, and also what the Bible promises. I have a plan to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a hope and a future. And I'd really love to just encourage everyone as they listen to this, don't give up on hope. Don't give up.
Anybody at City will know 2020 has been our year where our vision was to be hope bringers, and it's so relevant in this time. Sandy, we so appreciate you being with us. This is part 1 of our conversation. We are going to be having a part 2 in a few days. And so we hope this has been helpful. Our part 2 is going to look slightly different as we take a bit more of a Q&A approach. And so I would encourage you, if you've got questions for Sandy, please feel free to throw them into the comment section. Otherwise, you can email them to us at hello@citygodfirst.co.za. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to be getting Sandy to answer those in the next few days, and you'll be able to see that in part 2 as those questions get answered. But Sandy, thank you so much for your time. I hope everybody has enjoyed this. I hope it was an engaging conversation. Be safe. We love you, and we'll see you in a few days for part 2.